Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I am not joined this week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling. It's Thanksgiving week, and he's fully tied up. So I thought, well, this is an opportunity to do a solo libertarian angle on one of the subjects that I've spent a lot of time on, as longtime supporters of FFF know, and that's the Kennedy assassination. And this is, of course, an appropriate time since November 22nd was the anniversary of the assassination, and also because FFF has recently launched my ebook called The Kennedy Autopsy 2. You'll recall that The Kennedy Autopsy was released several years ago. It became an all-time bestseller for FFF. That, along with the book by Douglas Horne, who served on the Assassination Records Review Board, book entitled JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated. Those two books have sold, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,000 copies for FFF. And then one time we had a free download. I think it was the 50th anniversary of the assassination, and we had like 11,000 free downloads. So it's really been a fascinating experience, and I think you'll really enjoy, if you enjoyed the Kennedy Autopsy, I think you'll really enjoy the Kennedy Autopsy 2, because it revolves around the role that Lyndon Johnson played in the aftermath of the assassination, and all of the events leading up to his fateful decision where he announced that he was not going to seek re-election in 1968. Now, we've all heard the popular explanations for that decision, that he was scared to run against Bobby Kennedy, who had announced he was going to run. There was anti-war protests against Johnson. I present a different thesis in the Kennedy Autopsy too. To me, it's clear that Johnson was going to run for re-election all the way up to near the very end, and that there was really a much more logical reason that I present in the Kennedy Autopsy too as to why Johnson suddenly decided that he was not going to run. And it didn't, in my thesis, it had nothing to do with any fear of Bobby Kennedy or any other Kennedy. Johnson hated the Kennedys. The last thing he would have ever done is run scared in the face of Bobby Kennedy. I mean, Johnson had taken on some of the top figures in Texas politics. He took on one of the most admired and respected governors in the history of the state, a man named Coke Stevenson. So the thought that he would run scared with a man he despised, Bobby Kennedy, I don't think that rings true. I think there's a much more logical explanation for what happened. If we go back to the time that John Kennedy was declared dead, a team of secrets, Johnson immediately went to Love Field. And while he was at the hospital, Parkland Hospital, and while he was on the way to Love Field, he was actually the very first conspiracy theorist, because he posited the possibility and the concern, the fear that the assassination might have been the first step in a Soviet nuclear attack on the United States. And he brought that notion up at the hospital and on his way to Love Field. Well, after he went to Love Field, a team of Secret Service agents placed Kennedy's body in a beautiful ornate casket that had been ordered from a Dallas mortuary firm. And at that moment, the pathologist, the Dallas County medical examiner, a pathologist, said, well, you're not going to take this body out of this hospital because the law requires that I conduct an autopsy. Under Texas law, this was a straight murder case, and Texas law required an autopsy to be done. Well, this team of Secret Service agents said that they were operating under orders and that body was going to be taken back to Washington, and it was clear they were not going to be permitting an autopsy, despite the fact the law required it. So the pathologist, the medical examiner, Dr. Earl Rose, who was a highly respected pathologist, stood his ground and said, you are not taking this body out of here. And he refused to budge. He was blocking their way. Well, this team of Secret Service agents started screaming and yelling, issuing profanities, telling him to get out of the way. And then they pulled their suit coats back to brandish their guns, making it very clear that they were prepared to use deadly force on anybody that got in their way, including any medical personnel and including Dr. Rose. So at that moment, Rose steps aside and they take the body to Parkland or to Love Field, where President Johnson, now the new President Johnson, is having seats removed from the back of Air Force One to make room for the casket. Now, it's interesting that Johnson would conjure up this fear of the Soviets, raining nuclear bombs on America, because his actions belie that concern. In fact, his actions show that his concern was entirely bogus. That when he gets to Love Field, he lollygags. He just takes his time. He has all the luggage transferred from Air Force Two, the vice president's plane, to Air Force One, even though the planes were identical. And then he takes the time to find a federal judge to swear him in, even though the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, had told him that no such swearing in was necessary. And then he's taking the time to remove these seats to make room for the casket, which indicates a certainty that it could not have been the Soviets, because if you had even the remotest possibility that this was the first step in a nuclear attack, you would get into the air on Air Force Two immediately. You wouldn't delay, and you get up in the air and you'd be prepared to defend against that nuclear attack. But Johnson didn't do that, which indicates a certainty that the Soviets were not involved in this, which obviously raises the question: how could he have that degree of certainty? In any event, Johnson takes the body back to Maryland, where the plane lands, and instead of turning the body over to a medical examiner in Maryland or D.C., he turns it over to the military. Now, keep in mind that despite the fact that the national security establishment plays a heavy and dominant role in American society, and did at that time, this is not a military nation. It's not like Egypt. It is a civilian nation. And the president was not killed on the field of battle. America wasn't at war. And yet Johnson turns the body over to the military. Now, the military had imposed a policy of total secrecy on this autopsy. Everything was classified. And so people were not permitted to talk about what they were seeing and what they were doing during this autopsy. But in the 1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopens the investigation of the assassination, because by this time, most Americans are questioning the official version. It was all just too pat, lone nut communist kills the president with no motive whatsoever. The most popular motive they've ascribed is that he was a little man trying to become a big man by killing a big man, but the guy denies it, so it kind of belies that thesis. So there was really no motive ever ascribed for the official version. But in any event, the House Select Committee starts releasing people from their vows of secrecy. And a group of enlisted men came forward and told a remarkable story. They said that they carried the body in, President Kennedy's body, into the Bethesda morgue earlier than the official time that the body was carried in the Dallas casket. They said they carried the body in a cheap military-style gray casket that was similar to the kind of caskets that the soldiers who were dying in the Vietnam War were being brought back in. So it was like a military casket, cheap, gray, that type of thing. And they brought it into the morgue at 6:35 p.m. Well, the official version of when the body was being brought into the morgue was 8 p.m. in the big Dallas casket. So this was a remarkable story, and they were telling it to the press, and they were telling it to whomever was asking. But not a lot of people paid attention to this type of thing. Some people did, but the mainstream press certainly did not jump on the story in a big way. Well, in the 1990s, in around 1991, Oliver Stone comes out with his movie JFK, in which he posits that the assassination was actually a regime change operation on the part of the U.S. national security establishment, based on grounds of protecting national security. And of course, that created a huge uproar, controversy, and so forth. But at the end of the movie, there's this little blurb that says, the federal agencies, including the national security state, I don't know what the exact language was, but they're still keeping all their records relating to the Kennedy assassination top secret, classified. Well, this created such an outcry among the American people that forced Congress to do something about this. And so they enacted the JFK Records Collection Act of 1992 that mandated that the CIA, the Pentagon, and all other agencies, the Secret Service, release all their documents, records, everything to the public relating to the Kennedy assassination. Well, among these documents that the ARRB turns up is a document that had been prepared by a man named Roger Boyajian, or Boyajin. Boyajin was a Marine sergeant at the time during the weekend of the assassination, and right after the assassination, he wrote a written report that he gave to the military that they had been keeping secret, that said that, yes, my team carried in the president's body at 6:35 p.m. And Boyajin was still alive at that time during the ARRB session, so he confirmed that the authenticity of the document. So in other words, in the 90s, the Boyajin report confirms what these enlisted men were saying back in the 1970s. Now, the enlisted men said that after they did this, the military forced them to sign secrecy oaths. They said they were all called in and read essentially the Riot Act, saying that if you ever talk about what you saw here or did here, we will criminally prosecute you, we will court-martial you if you're still in the military, we will come after you. This is top secret, this is classified. And every military person knows that when you're told something's classified, you take it to the grave with you, unless you're released from your vow of secrecy. So the military clearly wanted to keep this thing secret, the early introduction of the body into the morgue. And so the ARRB in the 90s, by virtue of having all these records released by the ARRB, the JFK Records Act, everything was now out into the open, or at least a lot of it was out in the open. Also, the ARRB summoned a woman named Sandra Spencer, who was, she was working in the U.S. Navy's photography lab in Washington, D.C. at the time of the assassination. Now, she was a U.S. Navy petty officer. She worked closely with the White House on photographs, official photographs, top secret photographs, informal photographs. She had a close working relationship with President Kennedy, sometimes with Mrs. Kennedy. No one has ever questioned the competence, veracity, or professionalism of Sandra Spencer. It would be impossible to find a more credible witness than Sandra Spencer. Well, the ARRB summons her to testify. This is some 30-something years after the assassination. She tells them a remarkable story, and she's under oath. She says that on the weekend of the assassination, she was asked to develop the autopsy photographs of President Kennedy's body that the military had carried out. She'd been told that it was top secret and that it was classified. And so she had kept her secret for some 30 years. I mean, that's what military people do. You tell them something's classified, they're not going to talk, even after they get discharged from the military. Well, the ARRB shows her the official photographs and the official record of the autopsy, and she closely examines them and says, no, those are not the autopsy photographs I developed. The ones I developed showed a massive, like exit-sized wound in the lower back of President Kennedy's head, which implies a shot having been fired from the front, because when a bullet enters a person's head, it enters as a little small hole, but because it's pushing mass in front of it, it blows out in a much bigger hole. So the large hole in the back of President Kennedy's head implied a shot having been fired from the front. Of course, the official version is that the shooter was in the rear. So that her testimony was contradicting the official version. It was also throwing into question the authenticity of the official photographs and the official record. Now, if we go back to the assassination itself, President Kennedy, when he was brought into Parkland Hospital, was still alive. Barely, but he was still alive. So when he's moved into Trauma Room 1, the treating physicians immediately go into action. Now, the thing to keep in mind about Parkland Hospital is it is one of the best trauma hospitals in the country. I mean, that's what they specialize in. I mean, if you ever get hit with a gunshot, and you're around Dallas, Texas, hope that they take you to Parkland, because that's the place to go for trauma wounds. So Kennedy was in the right place to get treated. And so they immediately, of course, go into emergency treatment things. They put a tracheotomy in and did some other things. But suddenly, one of the treating physicians says, fellas, you need to stop everything and come and take a look at this. So they all go up to the head of the table where President Kennedy's head was. And he lifts his head slightly, and there's this huge exit-sized wound in the lower back of the president's head, in the occipital part of the brain of the skull, where some cerebellum is leaking out. Well, at that moment, every one of the treating physicians knew it was over. I mean, nobody can survive a wound like that. So they knew that no matter what they did, it was going to be futile, that it was just a matter of time before the president expired. And sure enough, he expired with just a few minutes later. But what matters is that those treating physicians had seen the same exercise wound that Sandra Spencer had seen in the photographs that she had developed. Well, of course, the official photographs do not show the back of the head to have that huge exercise wound. They show the back of the head to be intact. So clearly things are amiss here, and that's not the only thing. I mean, for example, they have the official weight of President Kennedy's brain in the official record, and it weighs more than an average person's brain, which of course is impossible because everybody acknowledges that a large portion of brain mass was blown out by the gunshot. So clearly things are amiss here, and that's the thrust of Doug Horn's book inside the records, inside the Assassination Records Review Board, and it's the thrust of my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, as well as The Kennedy Autopsy 2, showing that what happened in that autopsy was fraudulent. It was bogus, and both books, Kennedy Autopsy and Kennedy Autopsy 2, explain the nature of the autopsy, what happened there, why it was conducted in this way, and really the fraudulent, bogus nature of it, along with these reports after the autopsy that were later coming out during the Johnson administration. Okay, so why though? Well, first of all, there is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. And so that's why, I've always contended in both these books that if you want to understand the assassination, start with the autopsy. Because we've always heard that there's a lot of, conspiracy theories. That's the term that the CIA has been promoting from, decades now. That they send out, report to their assets in the mainstream press is to, hit people with conspiracy theorists, because that way it'll distract people's attention from the official version that they want to focus on. And so there's a lot of conspiracy theories. The mafia did it, Fidel Castro did it, space aliens did it, whatever. But one fact is undisputed, and one fact everybody agrees on, including the national security establishment, and that is that it was the military that conducted the autopsy. It wasn't the Mossad, it wasn't space aliens, it wasn't the mafia, it wasn't Fidel Castro. It was the military that conducted the autopsy. So you start with that undisputed fact. Now, as you study the autopsy and you read my two books and you read Douglas Horn's book, now Horn's book is a tough read. There's no doubt about it. It's a 5-volume work. It's like huge, and it's very technical in places. But I guarantee you, if you get through it, you will have but one conclusion, that this was a fraudulent autopsy. And then my two books are sort of a synopsis and expansion on what Horn was talking about, especially in Kennedy Autopsy 2. It expands on the things that were happening during the Johnson administration up to the time that he decided not to run for re-election. But once you conclude that this was a fraudulent autopsy, and it's impossible not to reach that conclusion when you start seeing things like, Sandra Spencer's testimony and the weighing of the brain and the actual brain exams that took place, and the testimony of the enlisted man, the testimony treating physicians like Dr. Robert McClelland, who you could Google online and see his version in numerous video presentations and interviews with the press. He recently passed away. You can only reach but one conclusion, and that is this was a fraudulent autopsy. And so there is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. There's just not. And so then you reach the logical inference from that. Why would the military conduct a fraudulent autopsy? What is the non-innocent explanation for that? All right, so let's go to another aspect of this, is why. Because that's a question I've often get. Why would the national security establishment do this? Well, how could I accuse them of something so unpatriotic that the military loves America and it would do anything for America? And I dare you suggest that the military and the CIA would do something like this. Well, it's precisely because of that mindset that they would do something like this. We have to put the Kennedy regime change operation in the context of other regime change operations that were taking place both before and after the Kennedy assassination. For example, if we go to 1953, which is 10 years before the Kennedy administration, the CIA engaged in a regime change operation against the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. And they ousted him from power in a secret coup. They kept their role in this secret until it was a conspiracy theory until people proved that they actually had done it. And their rationale was national security. That the reason that the federal government was converted from a limited government republic, which was the type of governmental system the Constitution had established, to a national security state after World War II, and a national security state is a totalitarian form of government structure. North Korea is a national security state, Egypt's a national security state, China is a national security state, Cuba, and so is post-World War II United States. And the reason for this conversion was national security. They said that since the Soviet Union was not bound by any constitutional niceties or constitutional rules, there was this Cold War coming, and it was a war to the finish. The communists were going to threatened to take over America and the rest of the world, and that therefore America had to adopt the same type of governmental system where there would be no restraints on the CIA and to a certain extent the military to prevent a communist takeover of the United States. And there was this huge obsession with communists. The communists were coming to get us. Cuba was a communist dagger pointed at America's neck. The dominoes were going to fall in Southeast Asia if America didn't intervene. And America had to stop the communists in Korea because otherwise they'd be heading over to the United States. And then you have all the McCarthy hearings and the prosecution of people in Hollywood being communist sympathizers or members of the Communist Party and so forth. So there was this national obsession that had been generated by the national security establishment, that national security was clearly at stake. So that's why they ousted Mossadegh, because he was leaning toward the Soviet Union, leaning toward the communists. He had just nationalized British oil interests, and which made him a socialist. All right, 1 year later, they do the same thing in Guatemala, which is much closer to the United States. Jacobo Arbenz was a democratically elected president. He had won a fair election, but he was a socialist, and he believed in establishing just regular, normal relations with the Soviet Union and Cuba. He had no interest in taking on this Cold War battle of the U.S. national security establishment, and that made him a communist. That made him an enemy. And since he was so close to the United States, they felt they needed to oust him in a secret coup. And so they engineered this brilliant, ingenious coup that ends up ousting him from power and then putting in a military dictator, which they love. I mean, the national security establishment has always shown a predilection of installing military people when they oust somebody from office because they think military dictators are good. They also conspired to assassinate a man named Patrice Lumumba, who was in charge of the independence movement in the Congo. They perceived him as being a threat to national security all the way over here in the United States because he was leaning toward communism. And so there was that conspiracy to assassinate him. 10 years after the Kennedy assassination, they targeted Salvador Allende in Chile and replaced him with a military dictator, Augusto Pinochet. Allende had been democratically elected, but he was a socialist, and he believed in establishing just normal, friendly relations with the Soviet Union and Cuba, and that made him a threat to U.S. national security. So they engineered a coup there that installed Pinochet into power, who proceeded to round up 50, 60,000 people and tortured most of them, killed 3,000 of them, raped a lot of them, sexually molested a lot of them. I mean, it was a horrific period of time. So you put the Kennedy assassination right in the middle of this. Now, what had Kennedy done to incur the ire of the national security establishment and the severe concern? Well, Kennedy had, by the time he was assassinated, had become much like these other rulers in these other countries. He had become a threat to national security in their eyes. Now, ask yourself that when you've got a national security establishment and you've converted your government to a national security establishment, and that national security establishment concludes that the President of the United States is a threat to national security, and that if leaving him in is going to result in a communist takeover, then what choice do you have? I mean, you can say, well, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to let the communists take over. But remember that old saying that you often hear from people within the national security establishment and others, that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. That if by following the Constitution it results in the destruction of the country, then it's okay to violate the Constitution. Well, the problem that Kennedy had with the national security establishment began at the Bay of Pigs. He got double-crossed by them. The CIA had engineered this invasion of Cuba to do a regime change operation, and it had failed. But they had told Kennedy, look, we think that this thing can succeed, any kind of air support from the U.S. And Kennedy said, fine, based on that representation, proceed. Well, it was a lie. They figured that as soon as the invasion got underway and started to fail, that Kennedy would have to provide the air support, and then, of course, following the air support would be ground troops and so forth to save face. That he couldn't afford to lose face and get defeated by a communist 90 miles from American shores. Well, the invasion starts to fail, and Kennedy sticks by his guns, and incurring the ire of the CIA. The CIA was furious because the CIA got defeated by the communists and Fidel Castro. So that started the big battle between Kennedy and the CIA. Kennedy was furious. He knew he had been double-crossed and lied to and set up essentially by the CIA. So, and Kennedy took responsibility for the debacle publicly, but he ends up firing Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA. He puts Bobby Kennedy supervising the CIA, who they despised, and he was Attorney General. And then he vows to supposedly to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the wind. Well, then the problems with the military start, because after that, the military is insistent on invading Cuba and effecting a regime change operation. They present Operation Northwoods to Kennedy, which called for fraudulent terrorist attacks and plane hijackings that were going to be carried out by CIA agents, in which real Americans were going to get killed, innocent Americans. But it was considered worth it, because that Kennedy could then blame it on the communists. The CIA agents would be posing as communists, Cuban communists, and then Kennedy could say, we've been attacked by the communists and Fidel Castro. I'm ordering the Pentagon to invade Cuba. Well, to Kennedy's everlasting credit, he rejects Operation Northwoods, which had been unanimously recommended by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And Operation Northwoods, by the way, was kept secret all the way up to till the ARRB sessions in the 1990s. So then the Cuban Missile Crisis comes up, and because the Cubans are, they're getting wind of the fact that the Pentagon and the CIA still want to invade. There had been multiple assassination attempts against Castro, that the CIA had entered into a partnership with the mafia to assassinate him, even though Cuba had never attacked the United States. In fact, in the entire hostile relationship between Cuba and the United States during the Cold War, the fact is it was always the U.S. national security state that was the aggressor. Cuba never attacked the United States, committed terrorist attacks over here, but it was always the CIA and the Pentagon that were doing the invading, the assassinating, the initiating of sabotage, terrorism within Cuba. And so Castro gets wind of the fact that the Pentagon still wants to invade, and so that's why he invites the Soviet Union to install missiles. Not to attack the United States. They often refer to these missiles as offensive missiles. They were nothing of the sort. They were actually defensive missiles. They were designed to deter the Pentagon and the CIA from attacking again. And in the event of an attack, to defend themselves with those nuclear weapons. Well, Kennedy realizes what's going on here, and he strikes a deal with Khrushchev and says, okay, look, I will guarantee I will not let the Pentagon and the CIA invade Cuba again. You return your missiles. And Khrushchev says, fine with me. That's all we wanted. Just guarantee, just leave Cuba alone. And so they struck a deal. As part of the deal, Kennedy also secretly agreed to withdraw nuclear missiles from Turkey that were aimed at the Soviet Union, which was consistent. If you're going to object to them pointing missiles at the United States over here, it stands to reason that they would object to having missiles pointed right near them over there. And Kennedy understood that, so he agreed to secretly withdraw the missiles from Turkey, and he did do that several months later. But once the deal was struck, the mainstream press has always said, historians have always said, that the Soviets blinked. Well, it really wasn't the Soviets who blinked. It was Kennedy who blinked. And it was a good thing he did, because if he had followed the recommendations of the U.S. national security establishment, there would have been all-out nuclear war. What the CIA didn't know was that the Russian commanders on the ground in Cuba had been given battlefield authority to use their nuclear missiles. And there's almost no doubt they would have done that in the event of an invasion, which would, of course, would have caused the nuclear missiles to start flying. So Kennedy struck the reasonable deal. He says, we'll leave Cuba alone. You take your missiles home. But the CIA and the military took the opposite view. They were furious, and so did many of the Cuban exiles, because this left Cuba in the hands of the communists, which they considered a dire threat to national security. So Kennedy was called a traitor. He was called, which pretty serious accusation against a president, a traitor. I mean, you know what we do with traitors, what every country does with traitors. He was called a coward, that he had appeased the communists, and he had left this communist dagger 90 miles away on a permanent basis. He had given his word that the U.S. would not invade Cuba again. So that was really the end of any kind of harmonious relationship. And that's when this bureaucratic war between Kennedy and the national security establishment was full out and full blown, even though it was off the radar screen. The mainstream press, the American people didn't know it was going on. But then Kennedy goes one step further. Kennedy starts to see that this thing was a huge racket, this whole Cold War racket, the national security state. Remember, Eisenhower had warned about this, President Eisenhower, in his farewell address right before Kennedy came into power. Eisenhower said, well, we've got this, what he called a military-industrial complex, same thing as the national security establishment, where he says this is a threat to our democratic processes. I mean, he saw how it operated. He had seen it operate in Iran. He saw it operate in Guatemala. He saw it operate against Patrice Lumumba. And so he understood the nature of this thing. He says it's a threat against America's democratic processes and our freedoms. Well, Kennedy was achieving that breakthrough, clearly. So he appears at American University and delivers one of the most remarkable, beautiful speeches you will ever hear in your life. And it's worth watching, or it's worth reading, or doing both. You can just Google, American University speech by JFK, where he declares an end to the Cold War. Now, this is 1963, and he says, we can live in peaceful harmony with the Soviets, and we're going to have peaceful, friendly relations. In other words, he was doing the same thing that Arbenz had done, the same thing that Mossadegh was doing, the same thing that Patrice Lumumba had done. He was reaching out to the communist world and saying, we can peacefully coexist. Well, peaceful coexistence was not in the vocabulary of the U.S. national security establishment. This was a war to the end as far as they were concerned. You can't trust a communist. And that one side had to win and one side had to lose, even if it had to be in a nuclear war. Kennedy took the exact opposite position and said no. And so then for one thing, on his American University speech, he doesn't even talk to the military. He doesn't tell them, or the CIA tell them what he's going to do. He just blindsides them with this. And he actually threw it in their faces, where he where he criticized the idea of a Pax Americana, which was a term that one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had used, General Curtis LeMay, who hated Kennedy, especially as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so, you've got this war taking place, and then Kennedy enters into secret private correspondence with Nikita Khrushchev, where they are agreeing what they're going to do to end the Cold War and just have peaceful relations. Kennedy was even talking about a joint moon shot where they both work together, which would mean sharing rocket technology with the Russians. And so you can imagine the paranoia, the fear within the national security establishment. It was just humongous that Kennedy might have become an agent of the Russians. And here he is now sharing rocket technology. And then on the very day of the assassination, Kennedy has an emissary over in Cuba actually having lunch with Fidel Castro with the idea of normalizing relations with Cuba, which of course would have meant a lift in the embargo, which still exists to this day, and just a normalizing of relationships. So if you look at it in terms of the regime change context of this period of time during the Cold War, Chile, Iran, Guatemala, Cuba, the regime change operations there, the Congo, then it makes sense that if a president is posing a threat to U.S. national security establishment, the U.S. national security establishment is going to consider it their duty to save America by doing what is necessary to protect national security. So all of this is covered in the Kennedy Autopsy 1, the Kennedy Autopsy 2, and FFF's ebook by Douglas Horne, JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Established, which delves into the national security implications and the motives that went into this assassination. So that's my libertarian angle for this week. Look forward to seeing y'all next week with my regular co-host, Richard Eberling. Y'all have a very happy Thanksgiving.